All rise for the jury. All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court File Number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. All right, be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
All
right. Thank you. We're adjourned.
So, counsel, Gates, I can send you.
When they were first released resonated in the prosecution over and over again. And Eric Nelson had an uphill battle because he was also dealing with this public perception that was out there. It was put forward by the media. It was put forward by politicians. You had the police chief himself saying this was not a lack of training. It was murder. So you had really, the cards were stacked against the defense, and Eric Nelson did his job as a defense attorney for his client, and it's commendable because it's easy to represent perhaps or put forth a case when the facts are in your favor. But when there's facts that are not in your favor and you have to deal with that on the defense, that is the difficult job. And Eric Nelson had a tremendously difficult job, and he should be commended for his lawyering.
Imran, I noticed that both the prosecution and defense used video of this George Floyd encounter with Officer Derek Chauvin. Were you surprised that both sides tried to use the video and to help tell their story?
The video, there was no escaping it. We saw it from day one, even before this trial commenced, even before the real prosecution was underway. There was no escaping the video. And we knew that the video was going to play a prominent role in this case, both on the prosecution side, also on the defense side. And we saw both sides using that to sort of spin their own take on the case, their own theory of the case. You had the prosecution obviously trying to connect the dots with the video, both on the excessive force and the unreasonableness of that force by Derek Chauvin, along with the causation factors that we saw. And then, of course, Eric Nelson used the video. He pointed to, tried to get the jury to look not at the 9:29, that's the 9 minutes, 29 seconds that the prosecution focused on, but to look at the totality of the video, the 16 minutes, if you will, to show that Derek Chauvin was confronted with something in terms of George Floyd's behavior when he first arrived at the scene, and he reacted accordingly to that. Ultimately, the videos were very compelling evidence. I don't think we can deny that. And I think the prosecution's argument during summation where they said, believe what you saw, believe what you see. The prosecution was referencing the video, and it was something that you could not escape. You had to deal with on both sides.
You're looking at live images in this special coverage, Fox News special coverage of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, and you're seeing folks gathered outside the courthouse. Some were chanting just before the verdict was announced. It appears some of the folks who have gathered are perhaps expressing a sigh of relief. My colleague, Fox News correspondent Caroline Shively, is there. Caroline, what are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Folks have taken to the street. We were in the grassy area right by the government center. Take a look around. Phil can spin for you. Folks have taken out to the streets. Maybe a couple hundred folks have stopped traffic. You see cars parked. You see a man with the bullhorn. Some folks are yelling some things. They are saying we now need to go to the police department. We need to put pressure on the police. They are very excited over this verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts is what this crowd had been hoping for. The sentencing won't be for another 8 weeks, but the judge could sentence Derek Chauvin to 40 years in prison. That is exactly what this crowd wants. You hear some honking. Some of these cars are trapped by this crowd.
Quite a scene outside the courthouse in Minneapolis after the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial was announced. Caroline Shively in the middle of the action there. Caroline, do you think a lot of folks there are relieved by the verdict, quite candidly, that a lot of the folks who wanted a conviction were the ones who turned out in the streets there outside the courthouse?
Goddamn right. Yes, absolutely. This crowd is absolutely ecstatic. They say the fight isn't over. You know who also might be relieved, Mike, is the 3,000 National Guard members who've been called up, the local law enforcement, the law enforcement from other states. They have been prepared for the worst. They have been looking for an angry group of protesters. However, this group right now is very happy. This is the verdict they wanted, the best case scenario. Derek Chauvin guilty on count 1, count 2, and count 3. We saw inside. He was immediately taken into custody. His bail was revoked. Just listen to that. Take a look, Mike. You see this crowd? This is exactly what this crowd wanted.
When we noticed stepped up law enforcement presence fencing around the courthouse after what we saw immediately following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis last summer, and of course recent violence in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota nearby, where the death of another person in a recent shooting incident. And so a lot of folks turning out, and hopefully will be a peaceful scene for the rest of this afternoon and this evening as folks gathered are honking their horns in reaction to the verdict being announced there. Caroline, you mentioned sentencing in 8 weeks, and so this case is not over. I expect you'll be out there in about 8 weeks or so. There'll be great anticipation that day, I imagine, as well, to see what the former police officer gets in this case.
You're right, Mike. This certainly isn't over. The jury now will have to look to see if there were any aggravating factors existed. That's some of the information that the judge will use, whether to give him the max sentence, 40 years, or perhaps as low as 12 and a half years, because he does have a clean record. So this jury will go back and see, was a child present? Was the victim treated with particular cruelty? If those answers are yes, we could see a sentencing on the higher side. That is certainly what this crowd out here is hoping for. Now, we also must think this is just the local jury that's handling this. A federal grand jury has been meeting to consider federal charges. If convicted there, the sentence could go up to life in prison for Derek Chauvin. But certainly the news of the day is he has been found guilty on all 3 counts. The crowd here is rowdy. The crowd here is happy. The worst thing we've seen so far, though, is just a big old traffic jam as hundreds of people hit the streets of Minneapolis around the Hennepin County Government Center, where this verdict was handed down just moments ago.
Quite a scene outside the courthouse there in Minneapolis. We expect that we will hear plenty of reaction in the hours ahead from both the defense and the prosecution, what worked in the case, what did not work. I know from talking to some folks that some people thought that the charges perhaps should have been more extensive. But when you look at conviction on all 3 counts, Caroline, clearly the government found the right charges because the jury agreed with them, right?
Yes, absolutely. And with less than 11 hours of deliberation, they came back guilty on all 3 counts. Another thing that we're hearing out here in the crowd, they're saying their fight isn't over. They are still working for racial justice. One man with a bullhorn just announced, we now need to go to Brooklyn Center. Of course, that is the site where Daunte Wright was shot and killed by a police officer on April 10th. Some of the worst protests we've seen was in Brooklyn Center over the last 8 days. So the crowd here is not finished. They will continue their protesting, their fighting, they're seeking for racial justice. The law enforcement, of course, is out in force. They will also not be resting tonight. The protests that we've seen so far, Mike, are peaceful. That could change on a dime. We have certainly seen that. But right now, just joy in the streets from the folks here.
All right, Caroline Shively, live outside the courthouse. Thank you so much for your time and your live reporting from the scene. Also joining us live now is Fox News correspondent Lauren Blanchard, also in Minneapolis. Lauren, what are you seeing? What are you hearing?
Yeah, we actually have been trying to stop people as they have been kind of walking away from this protest just behind me. And overwhelmingly, there is a sense of relief that they feel they can go forward from this. One man I talked to, a black man with his son, said he just feels like he can go forward today, a new person. That what he was waiting, he knew inside his bones that this was going to be a guilty verdict on all 3 charges, that he can prove to his son that justice system will work for him, something they said they have not felt up until this point. Another man is almost overcome with emotion over what he's feeling today, having heard the guilty verdict on all 3. Really just a lot of emotions. The second the judge read out those verdicts, there was a massive eruption of cheers coming from in here, people honking their horns, yelling. Just basically everybody in this area has been holding their breath for months and months and months over this trial. And finally today, they feel justice has been served for them, for their community, and they feel what they have been doing has finally worked.
Lauren, have you noticed law enforcement officers in the immediate area perhaps exhaling a bit, breathing a sigh of relief because perhaps it'll be a peaceful and calm night tonight as opposed to what it could have been?
Yeah, I think everybody's still going to be on alert just to watch and see how the evening goes, especially when the sun goes down. But, you know, when I was talking with some of these folks who were leaving, the demonstrators leaving this area, they said this is all they wanted. They just wanted to see that guilty verdict. Now they can go forward in peace. They feel what they've been trying to do with these protests night after night after night has finally come up to be something, worth something. Obviously, law enforcement in this area will not be taking any chances. There are thousands of National Guard troops in this area ready in case there are others who wish to do harm. But for the most part, what we are seeing, or for the entirety of what we're seeing down here right now, is a very peaceful and very happy group of people having heard this guilty verdict.
And Lauren, to the actual trial, the prosecution used video, eyewitness accounts, and medical experts. Clearly an effective approach. It'll be interesting to hear from the jurors at some point the impact of the video and some of that other testimony they heard in terms of getting to these guilty verdicts, right?
Yeah, and remember, it was on the state, it was on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin misused his badge, that he is the reason George Floyd is dead today. So those jurors came back just about 1 day worth of deliberations, and they were able to find beyond a reasonable doubt unanimously that on all 3 of these counts that Derek Chauvin was guilty. Of course, you remember the defense tried to say that this is how a reasonable police officer would act. The jurors obviously did not feel the same.
Yeah, tried to emphasize reasonable use of force, a reasonable police officer. We heard a whole lot of reasonable in the closing arguments, also talked about George Floyd's drug use and some of his other troubles, but clearly it didn't work in this case, Lauren.
Yeah, the only reasonable there was at the end of the day, because I noted how many reasonables were said in court, the only reasonable is that it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin was guilty.
Lauren Blanchard outside the courthouse in Minneapolis, live on the scene. Fascinating scene there. A lot of folks who've gathered for the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial there in Minneapolis, eager for the verdict, anxious to hear the verdict. And as we've been reporting, this is Fox News breaking news coverage. Minneapolis jury finding former police officer Derek Chauvin guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. Sentencing will happen in 8 weeks, so we are not done with this case just yet. I'm wondering if we can go to Imran Ansari, our criminal defense attorney, with us for this special coverage. Okay, well, let's take a live look at the scene there outside the courthouse. You see a Black Lives Matter banner being waved, a bit of a parade outside the courthouse, stepped up law enforcement presence on the scene there, awaiting the verdict that was announced just a short time ago, and Judge Peter Cahill basically thanking the jurors for their hard work, their serious deliberation. And after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury announcing the verdict. Caroline, what's the latest from your vantage point? My colleague Caroline Shively on the scene.
Pure joy here in the streets, Mike. Check it out. Folks are driving around. They're honking. They're waving the signs. You saw the Black Lives Matter folks hanging out of their sunroofs, screaming and shouting. There are bullhorns. Let's walk up a little closer and see what they're doing here. Everyone, I would say a couple hundred folks here in this 2 blocks that I can see, they have flags, they have bullhorns. They're very excited. They were watching on their phones as the guilty verdict came in. When they said count 1 guilty, the first shout of joy came up from this crowd. Count 2 guilty, count 3 guilty, and they are absolutely ecstatic. Now, there are certainly people in this town, in this state, and in this nation who are watching now who are unhappy with this verdict. They do not think it was just, but everyone standing out in the street outside the Hennepin County Government Center at this hour is very happy how this trial went down, Mike.
You know, Caroline, Derek Chauvin did not take the stand in this case, and I think it'll be interesting to note when we eventually hear from jurors whether that had any impact on their deliberations.
Yeah, that's interesting. A very quick deliberation. Of course, that is normally good news for the prosecution. That was certainly the case here. You also have to think that Derek Chauvin was sitting there during the weeks of testimony with a mask over his face. He was portrayed as a monster by the prosecution, and who said he showed no compassion. You remember that famous line from the prosecutor who said, "This is not policing, this was murder." And that was agreed to by the folks, by those 12 jurors, the split jury between men and women, diverse in their racial makeup, in their ages 20.
Well, we're taking you back to the Fox 13 studios here in Salt Lake City. You've been watching history, and we didn't know what the history would be. Of course, that's the case with anything we anticipate. And as you can see, things in Minneapolis are settling down. People waiting with bated breath as to what the jury would find in the Derek Chauvin case. They found him guilty on all 3 counts that were available to them, and it looks like those folks who were there to hear the verdict were pleased with that. Of course, there's going to be a whole lot more to cover locally and in Minneapolis and around the country as to the reaction to this verdict on all sides, and we will do that. We're going to be here at 4. Hope you join us live at 4 and at 5. For now, we're going to take you back to regular programming.
Looks like I'll be having to go after the brother next.
The police got involved because he was saying that they were trespassing, which was very incorrect.
So I went there with my contractor to change the locks, and they wouldn't get out. So when the police came, they said this is a eviction case.
He was not trespassing. He was on the lease since 2017.
She would call me, and then 5 minutes later call the health department. I never wanted her kicked out.
The health department, okay, there was molding in the house, no heating in the house, there was infestation of rodents.
It's time to go back to court.
I'm just done.
You owe him $3,950.
No, I don't.
The virus held up her security deposit.
I missed the walkthrough because I had COVID symptoms.
Your Honor, he didn't even let us know.
It's irrelevant to this case that you had COVID.
Now, a landlord holds nothing back.
You want me to go to a walkthrough and infect somebody with COVID?
Send your mother, send your father, send a friend. You're full of baloney.
This is Judge Judy. Michelle Spaulding is suing her former landlord, Kirk Wilterding, for the return of her security deposit.
Judge's case number 113 on the calendar in the matter of Spaulding versus Wilterding. Parties have been sworn in.
Miss Spaulding, your case is a relatively simple one. It is your claim that the defendant owes you your security deposit back. You and your family rented a house from him.
That is correct.
He gave you a 60-day notice. You did, in fact, move out, and he retained $3,950 of your security.
That is correct.
So far correct? Okay, so, Mr. Wilterding, I'm going to start with you, sir. The Spauldings rented your house. They gave you in security deposit $3,950, which you know you're supposed to keep segregated in a separate account. Do you know that?
I do know that, and it was
That's
segregated.
a yes? Good. And you can prove that to me if I needed it.
Sure.
Sure.
Yes.
In what bank did you keep it segregated?
I have it in a separate account that's one of my LLCs, not a personal account.
What LLC do you have there?
Just my account.
$3,950.
My account. And I actually sent them a copy because they asked for it.
Then I'm just asking you, why can't you tell me what bank you have their $3,950 in?
It's Wells Fargo.
Okay. Let's proceed a little.